Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at Space Cowboy Books Online. I'm your host, Jean-Paul Garnier, and tonight we are here with S.B. Divya. S.B. Divya is the Hugo and Nebula nominated author of Meru in the Alloy Era series, Machine Hood, Runtime, and the short story collection Contingency Plans for the Apocalypse and Other Possible Situations. Her stories have been published in various magazines such as Analog and Uncanny, on Tor.com, and several anthologies, including Seasons Between Us and Rebuilding Tomorrow. She holds degrees in computational neuroscience and signal processing, and she worked for 20 years as an electrical engineer before becoming an author. A lover of science, math, fiction, and the Oxford comma, she enjoys subverting expectations and breaking stereotypes whenever she can. I'm going to hand it over to Divya to read us an excerpt from Loka.
Thank you so much, Jean-Paul. All right. I'm going to read starting at the beginning this time, which is day minus 46. In the old epics, heroes are born to a great destiny. They're supposed to feel grateful for that, proud that fate has chosen them over all others. I'd spent my entire life living under the weight of such expectations, except that my future wasn't foretold by the gods or some kind of magic. It was a result of my carefully crafted DNA and the choices my parents had made 16 and a half years earlier. A more immediate destiny lay a few hundred meters ahead, and all I had to do to reach it was keep pedaling. Behind me, my three friends, the only ones close to my age on this world, rode their own bikes. For once, I was in the lead. I suspected that Somya, my heart said, had told the others to let me reach our final destination first, since I would never make the journey again. The path beneath our tires meandered through a grove of fruit trees. Glittering insectoid microconstructs buzzed between the blossoms, while larger metal constructs tended to the care and feeding of the plants, their appendages working as both arms and legs. All of them were extensions of Chedi, a conscious megaconstruct whose vast cylindrical body formed the only home I'd ever known. She carried several hundred humans through space, traveling from one star system to another, including visits to the solar system every couple of years. Unlike my friends, though, I had never set foot on Earth. My parents had been exiled shortly before my birth, and they chose to serve their time inside Chedi. Because my mother was pregnant with me, the law technically included both of us for the duration of her exile, but that period was about to end. In a few days, Chedi would transit to the solar system, and my mother, my maker, and I would leave for Earth. For the first time in my life, I would learn what human existence really meant. I brought my bike to a halt in front of a box-like structure that stood a bit taller than me. A doorway led into a shaft that rose along one of Chedi's flat ends, all the way to her central axis. We didn't have time to go that far up, but there were plenty of stops along the way. Somya, Hui, and Karyana arrived shortly after me. The three of them formed a spectrum, Som with their long black hair in a braid, Hui with a messy mop of loose red curls, and Carrie with her blonde hair cropped short. With my black hair short and curly, I had aspects of all three. You came in first, Somya said, miming applause. I rolled my eyes. I know you let me win. My statement was met with three overly innocent expressions and a volley of protestations. I couldn't help laughing at my friends. It felt good to beat them, even if they had allowed it. Hui usually won our races, being both the tallest and the oldest of our small group. At 18, he was a year older than Somya, who led me by about 4 months. Karyana, 14, was our most junior member. She was also our newest, having come into Chedi only 2 years earlier, during our last visit to the solar system. First to arrive means first up, Somya said. They waved me through the doorway. Inside the housing, a squat maintenance construct slept in its power cradle. I walked past it and through another doorway into a narrow shaft that housed a ladder. With a deep breath, I began to climb. The rungs trembled as the others stepped on. The biosynthetic material felt warm under my grip. The ladder and the shaft walls glowed with pale lime green luminescence. The color reminded me of sunlight on the floor of a rainforest, which I'd only seen in immersives. Ouch! You just kicked my head, we protested. I paused my climb for a second to make sure his words weren't directed at me. A downward glance revealed Somya's dark head immediately below my feet. I kept climbing. Sorry, Somya said. My foot slipped. I looked up the utility shaft and saw our destination bordered by a ring of green light. It outshone the gentler glow of bioluminescence that traced the carbon composite walls around us, and it marked the entrance to the first hull access point. Almost there, I called down. Less than a minute later, I stepped off the rungs and clambered into a tunnel. I walked forward until I found a pile of coats that we'd left on our last visit. I shrugged mine on and passed the others to my friends. I guess you won't need these much longer, we said. I will once we get to Meru, I said. I couldn't keep the bitterness from my tone. After a brief stay on Earth, my parents and I would move 200 light years away to a different planet, one where they intended for me to fulfill my birthright. Come on, Axe, Somya said. They slung an arm around my shoulder and dragged me deeper into the access tunnel. You only have to put up with Meru for 5 years. That's nearly a third of my age, I pointed out. The air grew colder as we walked. Shady kept her interior climate pleasant for her human residents. Warm during the day, a little cooler at night to help us sleep, never too humid or too dry. From what I had heard of Loka, the latitudes of Earth managed by the alloys, it was much the same way. The weather didn't get uncomfortable until you passed into the out of bounds. Meru's atmosphere, on the other hand, was left to do whatever it pleased. The humans on its surface, the few that alloys allowed to live there, had to wear coats, shoes, and even hats to maintain a comfortable body temperature outside. What's happening in 5 years? Karyana asked. I'll explain on the other side, Somya said. We arrived at the hatch. Somya touched their hand to its sensor, and Chedi swung it open. The thin, cold air stung my face and lungs. We let the door shut behind us. We would have 15 minutes to return. If we didn't, Chedi would send one of her ambulatory constructs to check on us. She understood human development enough to know that adolescents needed to exercise our independence and have a place we could talk without oversight. That was what she told us when we asked to go into the space between her inner and outer hulls. A walkway about 2 meters wide hugged the inner wall, its surface stippled to provide grip for the feet of a construct. It worked well for our shoes, too, a good thing considering the vertigo-inducing wall of ice ahead of us. The solid mass provided radiation shielding for all life inside Chedi. Most of it loomed in darkness, but ambient light from the walkway lit the nearest surface and revealed shades ranging from pale blue to white. I reached out and touched the ice to complete our ritual visit. The others did the same before sitting down on the walkway. In 5 years, Somya explained, Axe will turn 21. Their breath formed wispy clouds as they spoke. At that point, she'll be a legal human adult, and she can go wherever she wants. Karyana craned her head past Hui's bulk and asked me, I thought your parents let you be an adult at 15 because of your maker. My mother was human, but my other parent, my maker, was an alloy, a genetically engineered descendant of humankind and the current dominant species in the constructed democracy of Sol. Since birth, my parents had access to my bodine, a system that integrated with all my bodily functions and allowed me to access any public network. After age 15, my maker convinced my mother to give me full privacy, a choice that humans didn't have to make since their children didn't get bodies. Only alloys had the internal networks usually, but I'd received one at my parents' request. It wasn't my only unique feature. The other one was a carefully kept secret, and I hadn't yet revealed it to Kariana. My adult status only applies in Chedi, I explained, because she can set her own laws within herself. On Earth and everywhere else in the CDS, I'm still considered a minor. That changes when I turn 21, and when that happens, I'm going back to Earth so Sonia and I can do the Anthro Challenge. As part of Kariana's induction into our group, we had insisted that she read A Journey of Human Power by Rune Ederson, the only human being alive who had circumnavigated the Earth using human-era technology. He was the first to call it the Anthro Challenge, back in 691 AE, 30 years before I was born. I was determined that one day I would replicate his accomplishment.
Thank you so much for sharing with us, Divya. So since this is technically book 2 in a series, although a standalone, I wondered if we could start with perhaps a short recap of Meru and also a bit of background about the alloys.
Yeah, so both Meru and Loka do stand alone. However, Loka takes place 16 and a half years later. So you can probably guess the ending of Meru. That story is in a way about Akshaya's genesis. It's a story of her parents' journey and how a lot of changes happen on planet Earth after the discovery of the planet Meru, how Akshaya's mother, who is a human woman with sickle cell disease, ends up being well suited to the planet and gets sent there as part of a sort of scientific research mission. Um, some of the laws involving human space travel are very different in Meru. It's a bit more of a political book. It's a lot more of an adventure in space, whereas Loka starts on the spacecraft Chedi, but ends up being much more of a planetary story. Um, and let's see, what else? The alloys. So in both books, we are well into what is known as the alloy era, which takes place about 1,000 years-ish into our future from our present. And human beings are still human beings, but in the intervening millennia, they cycled through robots and androids and eventually melded the two with these genetically engineered semi-organic beings called alloys. They are our post-human descendants because they do have human DNA, but they also have additional DNA that lets them have features that no human being ever could, like the ability to live in the vacuum of space. So they don't need to breathe air. They don't need solid food. They use solar energy to basically hydrolyze water to provide themselves with oxygen and propellant. So very interesting constructions. Alloys come in various sizes, some of whom are very large, including Akshaya's maker, who is known as an alloy pilot, and they can actually carry human passengers inside of themselves. And that is how her maker and her mother meet in the first book.
And so because it's series, but they're also standalones, I wonder what complications arise for you as an author, and what strengths are there in having books that totally stand alone but are occupying the same world or the same universe.
Well, full disclosure, I've never written a continuing series. So thus far, all my stories have stood alone, which made this project a little bit easier from that standpoint. Um, so I think one of the benefits for me personally was that I was able to tell a very different story with the second book. As I said, Meru is much more like epic space opera. I mean, it spans, multiple planets, big politics, big issues, whereas Loka is a bit more of an intimate story. It's more of a character journey. A lot of it takes place on Earth. And and I think I personally am a very idea-driven writer, and I like having that freedom to do something very different, but set in the same universe, and even with some interrelated characters. Writing an actual series, you have to do a lot more upfront planning for the series arc, and you have to kind of tie it all together. Thematically, tonally, there needs to be continuity, and maybe one day I will actually sit down and write a series. But William Gibson is famously, at least within the writing community, known for saying that he's really happy he never wrote a series, and often advises writers to just do standalone books. And I kind of feel like I'm following in those very illustrious footsteps, because every book lets me kind of come up with more interesting world building details, with new characters, new settings, and I really like playing around with those.
Best of both worlds, and we're gonna talk a lot about world building, and we will get to that audience question in a moment, but I want to stick with the books for a minute. In Loka, a few of the major themes in the book are friendship, and also not giving up under adversity and severe hardship. What made you want to write this kind of story, and how, as a writer, how do you go about balancing successes and failures along the way while propelling the story forward?
Okay. Um, so in terms of friendship, the first book was more about an intimate relationship between two people. And so for the second one, I wanted to do something a little different. And I feel like this one's a bit of a road trip kind of story. And it's like, buddy road trips are always nice, right? Like, who better to have on your adventures and misadventures than your dearest friend. And so that's kind of, and then of course, the age being sort of in late adolescence, romance is common, and it's commonly brought in, especially in young adult stories. But I just kind of wanted to break the mold a bit, and stay focused on a friendship that really just stays, a friendship at the core of it through the whole thing. And in terms of the challenges of pacing, a lot of my stories tend to be adventure stories, because prior to getting long COVID and getting sick myself, I liked going on adventures. I've backpacked and scuba dived and traveled, and so this book was a bit of a vicarious way for me to do a circumnavigation of my own. And I think, as anyone who's gone on any kind of long travel or nature travel knows, things don't always go according to plan. And sometimes that's where the fun comes in. And sometimes that's, it can also be challenging. And especially, I think, if you are disabled or chronically ill or have other types of physical challenges or mental health challenges, sometimes those obstacles can be really overwhelming, and there can be pressure both internally and externally, to quit, right? To do what's better for your body, not necessarily what's good for your soul. And that is definitely something that I have personally experienced, especially these last few years, trying to balance my needs versus my wants, right? And so that was something I felt was important to bring to this story. This is not a disabled person with a superpower. This is an actual human being who has limitations, as many of us do, and yet wants desperately to persevere. And so I did want the readers to kind of take that journey and experience some of that struggle, because we feel like in science fiction, And even in fantasy, a lot of times we don't see it. We want the heroes to just be heroic. Um, and if they have moments of doubt, it's usually more in terms of internal motivations, or interpersonal connections, or even just lack of faith in their own abilities. But rarely is it that they literally physically cannot go on, right? And and so that was another way I kind of wanted to break the mold with this and say, what if we throw not your typical hero into the situation? And that is true of the main character in Meru as well. Akshaya's mother, Jayanti, also has sickle cell disease, and it was not easy for her to go herring about the galaxy either. And she also kind of had to face some of those decision points, which I was fun to kind of bring it back into this book, because as a parent, you get very protective of your child, and you kind of forget the very dangerous things you did on your own, right? It's easy to disregard, well, but I survived those, or the world was a different place then. And so confronting, your own past, and letting go of your children, that's a small part of this book, but it's definitely there.
Definitely going to return to family in a second, but I want to jump ahead in my questions, and ask you to talk a little bit about the Anthro Challenge,
Mhm.
and what that is, in the book and for the characters personally, and um, and the Anthro Challenge being such a big thing, despite space travel being a major part of the culture in the book, and specifically how sailing and oceans are such an important part of this story, because I really enjoyed how much of it took place in boats and on the sea, despite it being this high-tech universe.
Right. Um, so the Anthro Challenge, as you got from that little bit of reading, is one where people eschew alloy era technology. So they're going back, hundreds of years to what we have available today, and a little bit from today, but not too much. And the idea is, it's just for fun. There's no prize. It's not a race. It's a lot like, so when I went to research some of this, I found people who had cycled around the world, who had motorcycled around the world, who had run. And obviously, they can't do some of these things over water, but circumnavigation has, I feel like, been in humanity's blood for uh, probably ever since we got on a boat, or even walked from one coast to another, right? And recognized that there's more out there. And so let's see. So we asked, why is it important to the characters? For Akshaya and Somya, but especially for Akshaya, she really wants to understand what it means to be a human being on Earth. And having read this book, she's really inspired, and she feels like this would prove something, not just to herself, but to her parents, and possibly eventually to society at large, that this is something she can do, that she can live and thrive and experience everything that Earth has to offer. And so she really, really wants to do this. And, as you could tell from the conversation, right? Her original plan of having to defer this for 5 years is going to be brought in much, much sooner. And this is the journey that occupies much of this particular novel. And so a lot of people who circumnavigate today using land-based vehicles or methods of transportation end up flying on airplanes across the ocean. And obviously we have that technology. That is human era technology. So it kind of begs the question, why would they go on a boat? Why would they not just fly? It would be so much more expeditious. Um, one big reason is in this future, there are certain human era technologies, devices, and machines that no longer exist. The way of life is quite different, even in Meru and continuing through Loka, as part of a sort of contract to do better with the environment. And because this particular future society happens to believe that everything has a degree of consciousness, that consciousness is a physical, natural property. So, no more airplanes, no more cars, no more motor vehicles in general. Instead, alloy pilots will shuttle humans as necessary. But honestly, most human beings don't travel. In order to live a more limited and still happy existence, human beings decided to genetically modify themselves to be less ambitious, to be less driven, to be less needy. And so, in certain circles, it's even frowned upon what Akshaya and Somir are setting off to do and what this Anthro challenge represents. So the only way for them to cross the ocean is by boat.
I loved how much of it took place on the water. Um, Now, in this world of genetic modification, of technology, and hybrid, naturally it brings up some differences in family structure. Um, the protagonist has a very different type of family. Friends are considered part sib. Can you talk about family structure and your inspiration for these differences and how families are put together?
Yeah, a lot of it is again woven in with this particular society. So most children on Earth, the human children, are born of human parentage, but the alloys are basically asexual. They use artificial wombs to birth their young, and their offspring are 100% genetically designed, and they will use, greater than 50% of their maker's offspring, but everything else is basically put together like, fancy Lego blocks, right? What we think of today with um, very well-deserved apprehension as, designer babies, right? Is something that society went through and eventually ended up in this alloy era universe with very specific regulations on how children can be genetically engineered. So alloy family structure is already very different. Most alloys only have one child, if any, versus human beings who are still allowed to, have babies the old-fashioned way, though a lot of them elect to also use these artificial wombs and assistance from the alloys. Um, so there are a lot more only children, and therefore a lot fewer siblings. So I thought Heart Sib was just a nice alternative for a best friend, especially for two only children. And full disclosure, I am an only child myself. Um, and Akshaya has probably the most unique parentage in, all of the constructed democracy of Soul, because she has a human and a maker for parents, which is not common, and actually rather unheard of. So, so she is a misfit in multiple ways, and she kind of has to bridge two cultures, which again ties in with my own personal experience. I was born in India. I was there till I was 5. A lot of my family is still there. I go back and forth, and so coming to the U.S. and growing up here as an immigrant, I definitely had to bridge two worlds and two very different cultures myself. So that tends to feature in a lot of my stories, especially when it's about kids, because it's a struggle, and it really shapes, I think, your thinking and your reactions um, to the world around you.
So, one of my favorite aspects of the book, changing gears here a little bit, is the use of phoric language. Um, Can you tell us a little bit about this language, what inspired you to create it, and what challenges came along with using a nonverbal language in a book?
Mhm. So, phoric is what the alloys use to communicate directly to each other a lot of times. Because they live in the vacuum of space, there is no air. Where there's no air, there's no sound. And so I needed a way, I shouldn't say I needed, I wanted a way for them to be able to communicate directly with each other that wasn't electromagnetic. So I decided to take inspiration from our oceans, it's another place where there's no air, and give them chromatophores so they can basically flash, they can change different colors, and they can, flash at various different frequencies. And this forms the basis of the phoric language. And it was honestly a lot of fun coming up with, the I think I played more with the colors. So I kind of separated the flashing part, which, you could think of as akin to a really complex sort of Morse code way for them to make words. But the colors have more to do with their emotions, because one of the things I find we're missing on the internet a lot of times, right, is tonality. And we do what we can with emojis, but color is a continuous spectrum, right? And with chromatophores, depending on the molecules you have in there, you can have a pretty wide range of colors. And so you can have a much wider and more nuanced range of emotions that are expressed to each other as you communicate. And so I actually came up with a table of colors and emotions so that I wouldn't totally lose track as I was writing these books. I still managed to flub a few that my copy editors thankfully caught, but that was a lot of fun to kind of think about and develop that.
So while we're on this topic, I wonder if you could discuss a little bit about your research practices when it comes to things like the phoric language or sailing or the multitude of different aspects that you address in the book. Is that different from one book to another, or how do you usually go about your research?
I would say it hasn't changed that much book to book. I do a lot of research and world building up front as much as I can. Wherever possible, like with the sailing, I try to talk to people who are experienced at it. I've only ever been overnight on a sailboat once in my life, which was pretty awesome. But my spouse got to go on a 3-week sailing trip with a coworker from Los Angeles to Hawaii. And then I knew a couple other people, including the author Dersha Wem, who writes great books about it, who has been sailing, on long, like trans-Pacific type of journeys. And so I was able to talk to them and get, as many details as I can. But also, I watched some videos. I really wanted to actually go take like a beginner sailing course, but unfortunately, with my health at present, I couldn't hack it. And then for things like the alloys, and for technology, I try to keep abreast of what's happening in science news. So I, look at phys.org and various science newsletters, and just kind of skimming, the introductory paragraphs of things just to kind of get an idea of what's out there. And then some of it also came from watching a lot of nature documentaries when my daughter was younger. She wasn't into narrative fiction as much, so we watched a lot of documentaries and just picked up a lot of little things, And as I was thinking about genetic engineering, I again just trying to break the mold of, we often constrain ourselves to what we know about Homo sapiens, right? And with chimeras, it tends to be still very land based. Like at best, you might get wings so that somebody can fly, or fur or feathers. Um, but I wanted to also incorporate, the plant world, the insect world, the underwater world, and there's so much. diversity of life on planet Earth that it's like, if we really could pick at all that DNA and choose what we wanted, what kind of being could we put together? And that was a lot of the inspiration for the alloys. Was I really wanted a species that could live with a very minimal footprint. And it's like, if I was going to design that, what would it need? What would the species need to have? And so it's like, yeah, first of all, not space stations, because space stations require a lot of resources and they're very intensive and they're pretty dangerous. So it's like we have tardigrades, we have bacteria, we have well, let me roll that back. As far as I know, I think we have tardigrades and bacteria that can survive in vacuum. I saw a really interesting article a while back about how they are trying to colonize bacteria on the outside of the space station to protect it from radiation because the bacteria will absorb it, which that was really cool. And then we also have the deep, deep, deep sea creatures like there are these little mollusks that live by deep sea hot water vents that are covered in overlapping iron shells. So that was my idea for like the skin of the alloys, right? So yeah, so I just kind of picked and chose whatever I needed from things that already existed because there's plenty of inspiration out there.
A staggering and beautiful variety, to be sure. Um, Back to humans for a second. Another really interesting aspect for me to the world building and the culture in Loka is something that the characters call the aspiration and avarice disorder. Um, can you tell us about how this way of thinking found its way into the culture and what it means for the world itself in the Alloy era?
Yeah, I was thinking about um, how our views on mental illness and, the types of diagnoses we have evolved over, especially the last few centuries, right? Very rapidly, we've come to recognize a lot of behaviors as not necessarily within a person's control. They still have to be held responsible for their actions, but we try to help people, to give them treatments, to give them therapy, to do what we can so that they can be the version of themselves that they want to be. And I kind of put that together with thinking about uh, how do we ever get human beings to really live in a sustainable fashion when so much of our DNA and our brain structures drive us to behaviors that aren't sustainable. And it is a natural behavior. So what can we do? And it's like, put that together with the genetic engineering. And, if things get bad enough, maybe we decide to genetically engineer ourselves out of some of these behaviors, and things that we today accept as normative behavior might become disorders in the future. And so that's where, aspiration and avarice disorder was born, and, empathy deficiency disorder. And like, I could probably have sat down and made up a whole bunch more, but that's not what the book is ultimately about. So, I capped it at a couple of things, but it's as with most disorders, exists something that exists on a spectrum, right? We don't want people to be without any motivation or they will die. And that's something, we've seen neurologically and psychologically already. But at the same time, when people have too much uh, of either, it can drive them to do very harmful things to themselves, to the people around them, or to the planet, to societies, to governments. So, what if we could treat that with gene therapy? One important thing with Meru and Loka that I really wanted to emphasize was that these are consensual treatments, right? This is not intended to be a dystopia or a totalitarian sort of environment where people don't get to choose who they want to be. They still do, but certain privileges are not afforded to the people who can't live within certain boundaries of behavior. And that's not any different from the world we live in today. It's just where those boundaries are have shifted.
Oh my God, now I want you to write a DSM for the future.
that,
um,
that would be that would, that would probably make a really fun short story.
Sticking on that topic for just a second, I know it's not a huge aspect of the book, but I did find these things really interesting. Similarly to how ambition has become to be thought of as a disorder, possessiveness in ways has also become taboo and is frowned upon by many of the people in the culture. Um, I wondered what are your personal thoughts on ownership in general, and how does this affect the worldview of the characters in the books?
So this again kind of plays into the setup. Even going into Meru was I wanted to create a, while not exactly utopian, because I don't believe that there is such thing as a universal utopia, a society that solves a lot of problems of today, and one where again this idea of panpsychism, of everything being conscious and needing to be treated with respect, also extends to inanimate entities in the universe, right? So I think most people intuitively accept that human beings ought to treat each other reasonably well, and a lot of people are able to extend that into a certain portion of the animal world. But these days, far fewer people are seeing that with respect to, your bed sheets, your car, rivers, mountains. I think in earlier, more indigenous or animistic societies, people did have that, right? And they did kind of treat everything in the world around them as being imbued with life, and maybe even the sacred, if it was a religious thing. And so possessiveness, I think, kind of falls out of this kind of social construct, right? If you can't own another person, we've come that far. Can you really own an animal? Can you really own a piece of land or an area of sky? And so this again has in this particular future turned into a form of disordered thinking, because their answer is no. You can only really over own yourself and your body, and that's kind of where ownership ends. And you can inhabit a house, and you can walk down a path, and you can swim in a lake, but they're never yours to the exclusion of other people. And the alloys kind of have this too. And very interestingly, I tried not to have a financial system in the alloy era universe as well, because that ties into it. Like, you can't own anything. What do you really need money for? Um, so it leads to some interesting dynamics, especially barter dynamics with the alloys and the planet Earth and humans, because life does need resources in order to live and reproduce. And so, there's a certain amount of awareness there, and an acknowledgement that yes, we're going to have to consume, but let's try to do as little harm as possible as we go on.
I absolutely love that. Um, Here's a question from the audience from Casey. Do you ever find yourself reading the latest scientific papers from Nature and Science to help you get your sci-fi slash technology world building ideas? And I might add to that question, um, how do you balance the near future science in your research versus far future writing?
So first, yes, absolutely. I do read papers. I'm lucky that I had a fairly interdisciplinary college education, because I started in astrophysics and then I switched to computational neuroscience. So I got um, biology, physics, astronomy, engineering all kind of smashed into 4 years. And so I can know a little bit, I know the grounding basics of a lot of these. So I can usually at least read abstracts, and often even introductory sections of papers. And yeah, there is absolutely a wealth of ideas to be had there. It's a lot easier to take those ideas into the near future. I mean, where by near I'm talking, the next 100, 200 years, like the time frame of my first novel, Machine Head. Um, but at the same time, I will say that some of the really, really leading edge work that's happening in these papers doesn't look like it's going to be, commercially viable or even like widely available for much, much longer. Um, and one thing, when I was writing Machine Hood, I was really trying to extrapolate what could happen by the end of this century. And looking back at, the technology curve versus the social adoption curve. And we're heading into this really interesting collision, right? That Ray Kurzweil and others have written about, where technology is almost ready to outpace human biology's ability to deal with it. But that also doesn't entirely make sense, because ultimately we are the ones dealing with it. And so I think we end up being a sort of pacing factor in technological adoption. And I think we will probably continue to do that until or unless we start augmenting our own biology. And so that's where carrying it way forward, I mean, obviously, I don't know what's going to happen in 100 years, much less 1,000 years, right? So a lot of it ends up serving the themes of the story that I want to write. But as much as possible, I kind of try to think about it, at least in terms of like gross centuries, what could happen, what might be possible. And then I wanted to throw in some curveballs, because historically we've had a lot of scientific curveballs, right? Like we think something is done and decided, and then it's like, oh, wait, actually, we were completely wrong. Um, so that's where I brought in, the panpsychism. I also don't get into it much in Loka, but in Meru with space travel, there's these quantum reality transits. There's an entire fifth force in the universe that I call Thamity. And it was really fun to kind of play with some of those things too, because I wanted it to feel not just like an extrapolation of what we know today, but actually be strange to the reader. Like, oh, what is this? How does this even work? And try to still make it as scientifically plausible as I could.
And having worked as a electrical engineer for so long, how did that alter your thoughts and thinking about technology in general? And what from your other profession has found its way into the way you do world building?
Lots and lots. I think it's one of the reasons. I mean, I loved science fiction before I became a writer. But it was definitely one of the inspirations for going into science and engineering as a field, because I've just been fascinated by the possibilities of what could be, right? And I think I have, well, so I haven't been working in the tech sector for a few years now, again, since I got sick. But prior to that, being in that environment, talking to the other people there, brainstorming about what we need to work on next, what technologies are people looking for, what's going to be useful and what's possible, but also challenges and fears were very much present even amongst my colleagues, right? Like, what is going to happen with AI? How are we going to keep pace? What will people do if this technology puts them out of a job, right? Should we be working on this? Should we be working on it differently? So those kinds of questions were definitely forefront in my mind too, because they were very much present in the conversations around me, even 10, 15 years ago, especially in certain fields. I think medical devices and machine intelligence and biotech are three where, ethics questions come into play right up front, very, very, very quickly. And we ignore them at our peril. But at the same time, it makes really good and interesting questions to explore in a science fictional context.
Absolutely one of the strengths of science fiction. I wish more people listened to its warnings.
Yeah,
Uh,
right. And not take inspiration from its warnings sometimes misguidedly.
yes, we are seeing quite a bit of that, aren't we? Um, we're going to shift over to an audience question here. And I just want to give a disclaimer before I ask this question from Casey here. Amazon is a topic that I typically avoid here at Space Cowboy Books, being an independent bookseller. Now, that is no judgment on anyone. I am here to support authors and the field of genre fiction. And this is a very worthwhile and relevant question. So I will breach my own code normally, and we're going to talk about Amazon for a second. 47 North, this is from Casey in the audience. 47 North is a trad publishing Amazon imprint. A lot of authors have heard of Amazon imprints in the traditional publishing scene, but most don't seem to know about them. How did you end up being one of their authors?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this with a little bit of insider baseball without giving away too many details. In the book publishing world, in the world of traditional publishing, the process is usually that you write a manuscript, you send that manuscript out to literary agents. Um, if and when you are lucky enough for an agent to decide to sign you and represent you, they then take that manuscript out to publishing houses and submit it to like one editor per publishing house is usually the rule of thumb. And then you, the author, sit back, bite your nails some more, and see if anybody wants to buy your manuscript and turn it into a book. So Amazon, let me back up a step. So with Meru, we my agent took the book out on submission, and as you've heard from many famous books, it got rejected by a lot of publishers. Um, and eventually, my agent sent it to 47 North. 47 North is a very weirdly placed imprint because it is Amazon's trad pub, traditional publishing house. They have a variety of imprints in-house as a traditional book publisher. So they, in a way, they're competing with their own, independent and self-published authors. I'm not sure why it exists, but the people who work there are very nice. They're very competent, and they ended up loving my book and offering me a 2-book deal with Mayor and Loca. And at that point, honestly, I had one other offer on the table, and theirs was better because it was a 2-book deal. So I took it. I have zero complaints about working with them. They were great. But I did have some qualms because as a traditionally published author previously, it was a little bit like, oh, do I want to go under the aegis of Amazon? And it's a tricky space to inhabit because I like books and I like independent bookstores. And Amazon is a conglomerate, and we all know that their business practices are not great. Ultimately, I decided to go for it because it was, again, it was a solid deal. They publish and distribute to all bookstores. They don't only sell through Amazon. If it had been some sort of monopolistic practice like that, I would have refused, but they were basically like, we are, a book publisher like any other book publisher. We just happen to be under the corporate heading of Amazon. So I decided to go for it. So that is how I ended up under 47 North. Not a lot of people have heard of it, probably because they don't put out a ton of books, and they don't, while they distribute books everywhere, they don't market books that widely. Um, and so it's possible that, in the usual places that you might see Tor or Orbit or, some of the big publishers advertising, you won't find 47 North there. They operate on a pretty shoestring budget from what I can tell. But they do good work. And as I said, good people. So it's tough.
They did send me an ARC, which a lot of presses will not do, incidentally. And just another disclaimer for readers and audience members, that the publishing industry is constantly in flux. And I'm not sure what your experience is with this, Divya, but it's the publishing industry is always changing, and authors have to adapt to this, which is very difficult at times because it takes us a long time to write books, and the industry can have changed by the time we've finished writing a book from the beginning. And maybe you could talk a little bit about differences you've seen during your career in the publishing industry and how an author adapts to those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have been through three US publishers in four books. So, it's always an adventure. I hear stories from older authors and I read stuff by older authors of the quote unquote good old days when you would sign with a publisher and an editor, and both of you would have jobs for the next, 30 or 40 years working on your books together. Um, that doesn't happen anymore. Editors are also underpaid and overworked and tend to move around a lot. Um, that makes things difficult for an author because you're trying to establish a relationship with someone and then they move on, and the next editor may or may not like your style anymore. They might not want to buy your next book. So you have to also be ready to kind of move on. And I think there are so many competing ways of entertaining people today that books are just one of many, many avenues, and the industry as a whole is just getting compressed from all sides, right? It's sort of in a weird way like the middle class. They used to have the mid list in the book world where, you weren't a bestseller, but you weren't like selling 10 copies a year either. You were kind of somewhere in the middle. And that was a pretty happy place for a lot of people for a long time because books were one of the few forms of entertainment. Now there's so much more competition for people's attention. And while there are readers still buying tons and tons of books, the number of readers and the overall consumption has definitely gone down. Plus, you have the competition of independent and self-publishing books, which have gotten very, very good, right? But they often sell for a much lower price. So it is tough out there to be a traditionally published author, and I know people who are hybrids, who do some of both. They publish on their own and they go through traditional publishing houses. You have to be really prolific to do that, and unfortunately, I am a very slow writer, and now with long COVID, I'm even slower than I was when I was healthy. So traditional publishing is definitely a better place for me to kind of exist in that ecosphere, because it's like I don't have the time to to write three books a year and do the marketing and do the cover design and the hiring, and oh my gosh, it's so much work, right? So my hat's off to the people who can do it. Absolutely. And I have no doubt that, as we're already seeing, but as we're going to continue to see, that all these language models and AI stuff are going to impact the industry, even further. As always, it's going to be mixed, just like ebooks were mixed. And so, yeah, it's gonna continue, I think, to be a tougher squeeze for us traditionalists out there.
no doubt, culture, technology, the world will keep changing and evolving. But at Space Cowboy, we will be here for both indie and traditional published authors because we love all things science fiction. Um, so lastly, before we go, Divya, what are you currently working on and what's coming up next for you?
Um, Quite honestly, I don't have anything coming up in the near future. I'm very slowly embarking on my next novel, which once again is going to have to go out on submission. So who knows when and where it will land. First, I have to finish writing it. Last year, I took some much needed time off because getting through Marilyn Loca was pretty tough. Trying to focus a little bit more on rehabbing my health if I can, and very slowly working on something that's quite a departure from my books so far. Loosely inspired by a short story I wrote for an anthology a few years ago. That's kind of a contemporary fantasy, and it's going to be, I think, a bit more literary and a bit less adventuresome. Though I'm sure, as with everything, a lot of my familiar themes will show up. So
Well, we all have something to look forward to. SB Divya, thank you so much for joining us at Space Cowboy. Get your copy of Loka and Meru. Both are available in the chat, and if you're watching on YouTube, in the info below the video. Thank you so much to our audience for being here and great questions, and thank you so much, Divya, for joining us.
thank you for having me. Bye, everyone.